Have you ever wondered, after all that hard work, where does your tax money go? And what do they do with it? You see the deductions on every paycheck. You file your tax return. You hear politicians talk about investing in the future and fiscal responsibility. But at the end of the day, do you actually see results? Or is it all gone, swallowed up by a bloated system that never seems to have enough, no matter how much it takes? For years, Washington has written the checks, dispersed the money, and left you with the bill. But tonight, that question, the one millions of Americans have asked, was finally answered. The lights of CNN flashed, the air thick with anticipation. The hum of live broadcast equipment filled the silence between shallow breaths. Cameras locked onto targets. Producers gestured behind glass, signaling a countdown. On one side is CNN's host, his posture rigid, notes neatly stacked in front of him. On the other is Stephen Miller, arms crossed, eyes fixed straight ahead. The banner at the bottom of the screen flashes a deep red. Doge dividend, Trump's $5,000 vote-buying plan? The host wastes no time. Mr. Miller, let's get straight to the point. The so-called Doge dividend is nothing more than a political bribe. $5,000 a person right before an election? How do you expect the American people to believe that this isn't some desperate attempt to buy votes? Miller tilted his head slightly, the corners of his lips barely moving. He had been expecting this. It's fascinating, he said, his voice calm. You call it a bribe when we give taxpayers money back. But for decades, Washington has been siphoning billions of dollars into wasteful programs, and you call it management. The host didn't miss a beat. This isn't about management, Mr. Miller. This is recklessness. Experts say the Doge dividend will cut essential programs, education, healthcare, infrastructure, just to fund this election year farce. A chart appeared on the screen showing plummeting federal revenues. A bold warning: economists predict dire consequences. Miller barely glanced at it. Let me ask you this. If the Doge dividend is so reckless, why do Democrats tolerate government waste when it benefits them? A strain. The host adjusted his notes. We're talking about facts, Mr. Miller. And the truth is, this is going to cost America trillions of dollars. Miller leaned forward slightly. Number. What cost America trillions of dollars was decades of corruption. The Doge dividend is about accountability. And if the Washington elites are afraid of that, maybe they should be. The host doesn't let the moment slip away. Accountability? He repeats, raising an eyebrow. That's a nice word, Mr. Miller. But let's be clear. What you're doing here isn't returning money. It's slashing the government's ability to function. Our analysts estimate that Doge dividend would require cutting nearly $2 trillion from the federal budget. That's schools, that's healthcare, that's infrastructure. That's the backbone of this country. He gestures toward the screen. A new chart appears. Government programs on the chopping block. A sea of red ink beneath bold words. Projected losses under Doge dividend. So let me ask you, the host continues, voice sharp. What happens when people lose the services they rely on? When roads deteriorate? When hospitals lose funding? Is that the price of your so-called accountability? Miller leans back in his chair, folds his hands together. He exhales, slow, controlled. Let's break this down, he says. The Department of Government Efficiency has already cut $55 billion in waste. And that's just the beginning. Do you know what was in that waste, Mr. Host? He lets the question hang for a moment. $120 million spent studying the effects of cow flatulence. $6 billion in temporary relief grants that somehow became permanent. $100 billion lost in fraud under the last administration's programs. That's the government you're defending. The host shakes his head. You're cherry-picking numbers, Mr. Miller. Miller lets out a sharp breath, a half laugh. Number, I'm showing you reality. What you're defending isn't a safety net. It's a corrupt slush fund disguised as governance. A shift. The energy in the studio tilts. The host presses forward. What you call waste, others call essential funding. You're gutting programs millions of Americans depend on. Miller doesn't flinch. Really? He gestures toward the screen. Because the last time I checked, none of those programs sent Americans a refund check. None of those programs put money back in their pockets. So tell me, where did all that money go? The host hesitates, a flicker of silence. Miller leans in, his voice lower now. Here's the truth. The people watching at home, the people who actually pay taxes, they're tired of the excuses. They know where their money goes. They see it disappear into bureaucracy. And now for the first time, someone's saying, enough. The host shakes his head, recovering quickly. It's not that simple. You can't just tear the system apart overnight. Miller smiles. You're right. That's why we're starting by cutting $2 trillion in waste. And somehow, you're the ones panicking. The host inhales sharply. Miller doesn't give him a chance to respond. You see, Mr. Host, if you really believed in fiscal responsibility, you'd be celebrating this. If you actually cared about waste, you'd be cheering. But instead, you're terrified. Because for the first time, Washington isn't stealing. It's giving back. And that, Miller tilts his head, is the real threat, isn't it? A beat. The host clenches his jaw. His earpiece crackles. Behind the glass, producers scramble, signaling for the next segment. The screen cuts to another chart, this time, breaking down where the budget cuts will come from. The host finds his opening. Let's talk specifics, Mr. Miller, he says, regaining control, because I think the American people deserve to know exactly what will be cut and who will pay the price. The studio is suffocating with tension. Bright overhead lights cast sharp shadows, amplifying every subtle movement. The tightening of the host's jaw, the slight curl at the corner of Miller's lips. The air hums with static, an electric charge before the next clash. The host exhales sharply, steeling himself. His fingers tighten around his stack of notes. Mr. Miller, he says, his voice crisp, controlled. Let's talk about the numbers. The screen shifts. 72% of Americans oppose Doge dividend. The poll result looms in bold red. The American people are speaking, the host continues. And what they're saying is that they don't want this. You claim this is about returning money to taxpayers, but let's not ignore reality. Treasury officials, economic experts, bipartisan analysts, everyone agrees that this reckless policy is going to wreck our financial stability. It's another transition. The screen plays a carefully chosen clip. Chuck Schumer, his expression grave, voice low and deliberate. This is economic suicide. These cuts will devastate working families. This isn't fiscal responsibility, it's sabotage. The clip ends. The camera zooms back to Miller, whose face remains unreadable. He doesn't even shift in his chair. The host leans in slightly. So tell me, Mr. Miller, when this collapses, when roads crumble, when hospitals are underfunded, when working-class Americans are left to pick up the pieces, will the administration take responsibility? Miller chuckles softly, shaking his head. He lets the moment hang before finally speaking. You know, he says, voice like a blade sliding from its sheath, it's fascinating that the same people screaming about economic collapse are the ones who told us inflation was transitory, who assured us the economy was strong as hell, while gas prices skyrocketed and grocery bills doubled. The host stiffens, his fingers twitching against his notes. Miller tilts his head, pressing forward. Let's talk about this so-called poll. 72%? All right. Who conducted it? Who funded it? What were the questions? Because I find it hard to believe that hardworking Americans, people who've been taxed to death for years, would suddenly object to getting their own money back. He gestures toward the screen. And Schumer, come on. The man has spent 4 decades throwing taxpayer dollars into every failed program imaginable. And now, because someone is finally saying enough, he's suddenly concerned about fiscal responsibility. The host's lips tighten. There's an itch in the room, a shift, the first crack in CNN's armor. You want to talk about responsibility? Miller continues. His voice lowers, controlled, deliberate. Fine. Let's talk about it. Who took responsibility for the trillions wasted under the last administration? Who apologized to middle-class Americans when inflation crushed their wages? Who stood up for them when their jobs were shipped overseas? Silence. The kind that makes the studio feel smaller, heavier. The host clears his throat, regains his composure. His earpiece crackles. Producer scrambling. All right, Mr. Miller, he says, the edge returning to his tone. Let's go deeper. You say this is about the taxpayer. Let's talk about who really benefits from the Doge dividend, because we have reports that might tell a different story. The host barely hesitates. The moment Miller finishes, the screen shifts. New graphics, more ammunition. The producers behind the glass are scrambling, determined to regain control. Mr. Miller, the host says, tapping his notes. You keep saying this is about taxpayers, but let's be real. Who really benefits? According to financial analysts, the biggest winners of the Doge dividend aren't struggling families. They're corporations, wealthy individuals, the very people who need tax breaks the least. The screen flashes. Who benefits from Doge dividend? A chart appears, highlighting numbers in bold red. You talk about putting money back in people's pockets, the host continues. But what you're really doing is setting up long-term gains for the rich while giving everyone else a one-time payout. That's not economic relief. That's just another corporate handout. Miller exhales, shaking his head. You know, it's funny, he says. The left suddenly cares about tax breaks when it's not their friends getting them. The host's expression tightens. Let's talk about those same financial analysts you're quoting, Miller continues. The same ones who praised Biden's stimulus spending while inflation crushed working-class Americans? The same ones who defended trillion-dollar climate slush funds? The same ones who call your spending investment and are spending reckless? The host opens his mouth, but Miller lifts a hand. Here's the truth. When big corporations get bailouts, you call it stabilization. When taxpayers get money back, you call it a scandal. Maybe the real problem isn't Doge dividend. It's who's finally benefiting from it. The control room is signaling for the next segment. The host clears his throat, forces a tight smile. All right, Mr. Miller, he says. Then let's talk about stability, because according to every major economist, this policy is a ticking time bomb. The host barely blinked before continuing. The control room fed him the next line, and he delivered it accurately. Mr. Miller, we both know that economic policy isn't about slogans, it's about numbers. And the numbers don't lie here. The screen flickered. A new graphic appeared. Treasury officials warn Doge dividends will cause economic chaos. Every major economist agrees, the host continued. Cutting $2 trillion from the federal budget overnight isn't fiscally responsible. It's a gamble. And who will suffer when it goes wrong? Not the wealthy, not politicians. Middle-class Americans will be left behind as the economy collapses under the weight of these reckless cuts. Miller didn't react at first. He let the words sink in. Then slowly, he leaned forward. That's interesting, he said, his voice calm. Because I remember another time when every major economist agreed. They told us that printing trillions of dollars for COVID relief wouldn't cause inflation. They told us that gas prices wouldn't skyrocket. They told us the economy was incredibly strong. They were wrong then, and they're wrong now. The host shifted slightly, but Miller didn't let him interrupt. You want to talk about reckless policies? Miller continued. Okay, let's talk about them. Let's talk about the trillions of dollars wasted on broken welfare programs. The billions of dollars in foreign aid sent to countries that hate us. The taxpayer-funded pet projects of politicians who have never balanced the budget in their lifetimes. He gestured toward the screen. You call the Doge dividend reckless? This is what reckless looks like. The screen changed, but this time it wasn't CNN data. It was Miller's. A list of wasteful government spending, line by line, appeared behind him. $456 million for overseas gender studies programs, $2.1 billion for equity grants, with no oversight, $11 billion for government contracts awarded without competitive bidding. The host clenched his jaw. Something flickered behind his eyes. Hesitation? Disappointment? You see, host, Miller said, his voice sharper now. The issue isn't the Doge dividend. The issue is, for the first time, the American people seeing how their money is being wasted. A pause, the kind that changed the mood in the room. And let me tell you, Miller added, leaning back, Washington doesn't like it when people start asking questions. The control room was in chaos. The host's headset crackled. They hadn't expected this. That's not like cutting $2 trillion in federal funding. The host tried, his voice strained. Miller cut him off. You're right, he said. You can't just throw out numbers and expect people to believe them. Another silence. This time Miller let it drag on. But that's exactly what you did, right? The host exhaled through his nose, his fingers tightening around his notes. Okay, Mr. Miller, he said finally. Then let's take it a step further. If the Doge dividend is so great, why hasn't any other country on Earth ever tried something like this? The host tightens his grip on his notes, forcing a small, controlled breath. The control room is scrambling, his earpiece crackling with hurried voices. He can't lose control of the conversation. Not now. Mr. Miller, he says, regaining his composure, you say this is about giving money back to the people. But if this policy is so revolutionary, why hasn't any other developed nation adopted something like it? Why are economists worldwide sounding the alarm? The screen flickers. No global precedent for Doge dividend. The words flash in stark red. A map appears, highlighting the U.S. in isolation. Miller tilts his head slightly. You mean the same economists who told us China was a model economy? The same ones who cheered for lockdowns while small businesses crumbled? The host's lips tighten. You're deflecting, Mr. Miller. Answer the question. Miller exhales slowly. Then he leans in slightly, his voice quieter now. You want to know why no other country has done this? He lets the question hang. Because no other country has a government that's been this corrupt, this wasteful, for this long. Because for decades, Washington has functioned as a money laundering operation for special interests. Because the American taxpayer has been funding everything except their own prosperity. The host opens his mouth, but Miller isn't finished. And now, for the first time, someone is cutting out the middleman, and that terrifies people like you. A flicker of frustration crosses the host's face. He quickly flips to another page in his notes. Let's not pretend this is just about cutting waste. The numbers don't lie, Mr. Miller. If this passes, programs that millions rely on will be gutted. Education, healthcare, infrastructure. Are you really willing to tell the American people that their safety nets are being sacrificed for a one-time check? Miller chuckles softly, shaking his head. You mean the same safety nets that somehow always have money for illegal immigrants, but never enough for veterans? The same healthcare programs that charge Americans 5 times what other countries pay? You mean that infrastructure spending that somehow results in crumbling roads and billions of dollars disappearing into consulting fees? The host shifts slightly in his seat. He's losing ground, and he knows it. Miller presses forward. Washington isn't scared that Doge dividend will fail. They're scared that it will work. They're scared that Americans will start asking why they weren't getting this money back years ago. Silence. The host looks down for a fraction of a second, a blink of hesitation. Then his earpiece crackles again. A new instruction. His posture straightens, his expression hardens. All right, Mr. Miller, he says. Let's get to the real issue here. Who really benefits from Doge dividend? The host's fingers tighten on the desk. You don't like the answer, so now you change the question. The screen shifts. Another headline flashes. Doge dividend, who profits? The question still hung heavy in the air. The control room was desperate, pouring everything they had into the next phase. We've analyzed the data, Mr. Miller, the host said, his voice filled with confidence. And what we found is truly troubling. While you claim this is about helping taxpayers, the reality is that certain groups, certain individuals, are going to benefit disproportionately. We're talking about billionaires, corporate CEOs, and the screen shifted again, zooming in on the list of names. Wealthy donors, business leaders, Republican allies. Some of the biggest beneficiaries of this plan are people who are directly connected to this administration. the host continued, his voice rising slightly. People who are going to get the biggest tax breaks, the biggest tax refunds, while ordinary Americans are just getting scraps. He turned to Miller, narrowing his eyes. So tell me, Mr. Miller, who is this really for? Miller didn't hesitate. The American people, he said simply. The host scoffed. Oh, come on. You expect people to believe that when the numbers say otherwise? Miller sighed, leaning forward slightly. You mean the numbers say inflation won't be a problem? Economists tell us Biden's spending plans won't hurt the economy? Forgive me if I'm not particularly moved by another CNN-sponsored study. The host stiffened. He clenched his fists on the table. You're dodging the question, he snapped. Miller smiled. Number, I'm pointing out the hypocrisy. A pause. The atmosphere in the studio changed. For the first time, the host looked a little confused. Miller continued. You know what's funny? He mused. When billionaires get government subsidies for solar farms, CNN calls it progress. When hedge funds get bailed out, it's necessary intervention. But when middle-class Americans get tax refunds, suddenly it's reckless? The host clenched his jaw. He turned another page in his notebook. Okay, he said, his voice breaking. Let's put the billionaires aside. Let's focus on the average person. The data shows that despite your claims, the Doge dividend doesn't help the lowest income Americans. The ones who don't make enough to qualify for a tax refund, the ones who struggle the most. What do you tell them? Miller exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. Let me be clear, he said. After years of charging Americans more taxes, after inflation ate away at their savings, after Washington funneled their hard-earned money into endless wars and pet projects, now CNN suddenly cares about the working poor? Miller tilted his head slightly. I'll tell you what I told them, he continued. I said, for the first time in decades, Washington isn't taking more from you. They're giving something back. And I said, if that makes the media and the political world so angry, maybe it means we're doing something right. The control room was in chaos. The host's headset was crackling again. He was being given an escape route. He took a deep breath. Okay, Mr. Miller, if you're so confident in this plan, let's give it a try. The tension was palpable. The control room was in chaos. A cacophony of voices came through the host's headset. Rapid-fire instructions mixed with barely concealed panic. This debate was not going as planned. Miller wasn't just holding his ground. He was dominating. The host straightened, hiding his frustration behind a tight-lipped smile. He gestured to the screen. Okay, Mr. Miller, he said, his voice measured. If you're so confident in this plan, let's test it. The screen flickered. A new segment began. Doge dividend. Economic collapse? A new set of numbers appeared. Projected lost revenue, funding gaps, dire warnings from government agencies. The host clasped his hands together. We've reached out to a number of nonpartisan economists, he continued, his eyes fixed on Miller. And they all say the same thing. The Doge dividend will create a short-term sugar rush, but in the long run, it's not sustainable. We're talking about deep cuts, cuts that will destroy vital programs, cuts that will destabilize the economy. Do you really believe that Americans are ready for that trade-off? Miller exhaled slowly, shaking his head. When was the last time CNN worried about the funding gap? He said, leaning forward slightly. The host blinked. Miller continued, his voice calm but sharp. When Congress approved billions of dollars in foreign aid, where were those concerns? When Washington burned trillions of dollars on failed initiatives, where was CNN's outrage? Now all of a sudden, when we propose cutting waste and returning money to the people, now it's a crisis? The host shifted in his seat. That's not the same. It's exactly the same, Miller interrupted. The only difference is who gets the money. A pause. The host flipped through his notes, looking for his next attack. But Mr. Miller, the math doesn't add up, he finally said. How do you replace that revenue? How do you fund essential services? Miller sneered. I'll show you how. We stop paying for things that don't benefit the American people. He gestured to the screen. Let's see what Washington chooses to fund. Billions of dollars for overseas climate initiatives. Millions of dollars for insect research on treadmills. Endless funding for bureaucracies that just create more paperwork. But when it comes to paying taxpayers back, suddenly the government is broke. A movement flashed in the control room. A producer made a cutting motion across his throat, cutting the segment. But it was too late. Miller leaned back, exhaling. You know why this debate is so heated? The host said nothing. Because for the first time, Americans are realizing that the government has always had money for them. They just never want to give it back. There was silence, the atmosphere growing more oppressive. The host clenched his jaw. His headset crackled again. They needed to continue. Now his fingers tightened around his notes. He exhaled sharply. Okay, Mr. Miller, he said, trying to smile. So tell me this. If the Doge dividend is so successful, why is Wall Street freaking out? The air in the studio is thick, heavy. The control room has stopped scrambling. There's nothing left to scramble for. The debate hasn't just gone off script. It has been hijacked. The host forces a measured breath. His grip on his pen is white-knuckled now, his once controlled composure unraveling thread by thread. The producers behind the glass are giving up on damage control, letting the segment play out. All right, Mr. Miller, the host says, voice clipped, pushing forward one last time. Let's talk about Wall Street, because the markets don't seem to share your enthusiasm. The screen shifts. Wall Street reacts to Doge dividend. Panic and uncertainty. Stock charts flash in red. Analysts' headlines scroll past. Financial chaos? Markets unstable? Since this proposal was announced, the host continues, market confidence has plummeted. Investors are pulling back. The financial sector is warning of long-term damage. If this plan is so effective, why is Wall Street reacting this way? Miller leans back, chuckling under his breath. You mean the same Wall Street that begged for government bailouts while Main Street businesses were forced to close? The host doesn't answer. You mean the same investors who cheered as corporations outsourced American jobs, but now suddenly care about the working class? Silence. Miller shakes his head. The truth is, Wall Street isn't panicking because Doge dividend is bad for America. They're panicking because, for the first time, the government isn't working for them. It's working for the people. The host shifts again, swallowing hard. The cracks in CNN's framing are now wide open, impossible to ignore. But Mr. Miller, he tries again, desperation creeping into his tone. This is unprecedented. Every major institution, Wall Street, think tanks, international financial organizations, they all say the same thing. This is reckless. Miller exhales, tapping his fingers against the desk. You know what else was unprecedented? He asks. Donald Trump winning in 2016, tax cuts that actually boosted wages, manufacturing jobs coming back to the U.S. Every time something threatens the old system, the same experts predict disaster. He tilts his head. And yet somehow the country doesn't collapse. In fact, it thrives. The host opens his mouth, but no words come out. The studio is frozen. The audience watching at home can feel it. CNN has lost. Not just this segment, not just this debate, but the entire argument. Miller leans forward one last time. The real question isn't why Wall Street is scared, he says. The real question is, why is CNN so desperate to make Americans fear getting their own money back? The host's face tightens. He glances toward the control room, but there's nothing left to salvage. The earpiece crackles, giving him one last directive. Move on. End it. Now he straightens his papers, forces a thin smile. Well, Mr. Miller, he says, his voice hollow now, I suppose time will tell if the Doge dividend is a success. Miller just smiles. Time will tell, he echoes, and so will the American people. The host clears his throat. That's all the time we have for tonight. But as the camera zooms out, as the debate officially ends, everyone watching knows this was never a debate. This was a reckoning. The debate was over. The CNN host tried to smile politely, but the energy in the studio was unmistakable. He had lost. The network had lost. But Miller, he hadn't moved an inch. The camera zoomed out, capturing the final moments before the commercial break. The host shuffled his papers, signaling the end, but Miller, calm, confident, knew the ending had already been written. He leaned back in his chair, relaxing. You're right about one thing, he said, just before the screen went black. Time will tell, and so will the American people. The studio was tense, the control room silent, the producers exchanging worried glances. The energy in the air wasn't relief, but realization. CNN hadn't just lost the debate. They'd lost control of the narrative. Miller stood up, straightened his suit. He didn't rush, didn't gloat. He simply turned, met the host's eyes one last time. "Thanks for having me," he said, smirking. The host nodded stiffly. "Of course." But the damage was done. As soon as the clip aired, the internet exploded. Within minutes, social media was abuzz. Stephen Miller destroys CNN. Doge dividend debate burns back on CNN. Miller flips the script on corporate media. Clips of the debate had been viewed millions of times. The views were growing by the second. CNN's attempt to bury the Doge dividend had backfired spectacularly. Twitter was ablaze. The memes, the reactions, Miller's parallel breakdowns breaking every major point CNN made. And then Trump spoke. A simple Truth Social post, Doge dividend. They tried to stop it. They failed. The people wins. The internet exploded. Support soared. Calls poured in from congressional offices. What started as a policy proposal had become a movement. The Doge dividend was no longer just an idea. It was a symbol that Washington no longer controlled the money, a symbol that Americans were finally getting their money back. CNN tried to kill it.